All right, today I'm going to talk about classes and objects in Python. So the first thing to keep in mind is that objects in general are types of things that have attributes and can perform actions. So for example, an object, a dog, right? A dog object, right, has attributes. It has, what breed is it? What's the name of the dog? Those are attributes of the dog. Those are things that the dog has. And then there are things that the dog can do. So the dog can bark, the dog can walk, the dog can eat, and so on and so forth. So we have, again, objects are things that have attributes and can do things, right? Now, and of course they can have things done to them as well. But let's take a program, an object that you're very familiar with in programming. The string object. The string object has attributes. It's a data type, but it has attribute. It has the letters at each position. It has a length, right? So those are attributes. Now, what actions can the string perform? Well, a string with some operations, a string can find whether it begins with a certain number of, with a certain letter. A string can strip the white space. A string can convert itself and generate another string that's uppercase, right? All uppercase, and so on and so forth with very simple string operations. So these data types are very powerful, and you can create your own data types, your own objects in many languages, and Python is one of them. So I'm going to show you how to do that in Python. For this example, I'm going to create a question. I'm going to write a test for the user, right, with alternatives. So what's the area of a rectangle? And then I have several options, and the user selects the correct option or an option, and the question knows, the test knows whether it was correct or not. You can program this without objects for sure, but I just want to show you the utility of programming with objects. For that, I'm going to create my first object, which is going to be the question object. To create an object, you use the word class, and you are creating a class, okay? The class question. This is the kind of objects, a class of objects, right? The class question. Now the class question is going to have three attributes in there. It's going to have the text of the question, the multiple alternatives that I'm going to offer the user, and the correct alternative, the correct answer, okay? So I can put it like this. Inside the question, remember class, the name of the class, colon, and then the attributes. Text is going to be an empty text. Answers is going to be a list of potential answers. And correct is going to be what's the correct answer. So that's my object. Now, how do we use this in a program? Well, consider the following code. In here, I created a variable q1 of type question, and to instantiate, that's what we call it when we create a variable of the type of a class. To instantiate an object, we say question, open and close parentheses. So the name of the class, and then open and close parentheses. And notice how we can say q1.text. This dot operator accesses variables, and we'll see later on what else, inside the class. This accesses things that are inside the class, right? So q1.text refers to the text for the question that we created for q1, okay? q1.answers, and then I can say q1.text is this. What is the area of our square? Then q1.answers can be a list, right? That's what it suggested, right? So it's going to be side times side, length times width times side, none of the above, right? So clearly there's one correct answer, which is side times side. And the q1.correct, so the correct answer will be side times side, right? And I can print variables inside the class like q1.text, and I can print the object. So let's see how this runs. If I run it, oops, I need to save it, and then I run it. It says, it prints q1.text, which is what is the area of a square. If I print q1, the object, it doesn't know how to print this object. It just knows that it has some variables. So for now, it's just going to print a string like this, okay, which represents an object and says question object right there, okay? So that happens if I print the object. Now, look at what happens if I create another object. Q2, going to be question, and then Q2.text is going to be something else. What's the area of a triangle? Okay, and then whatever, I can put answers, I can put correct or not, whatever. But I can print Q1.text and then print Q2.text. I'm going to eliminate this print Q1, and I'll save this and run it, and look what happens. I'll print the first question text is what's the area of a square, and then what's the area of a triangle. So I printed each variable, Q1 and Q2, their text property, okay, or their text attribute. Now notice that they're both a question, but because I put a question class into Q1 and here I put a question class into Q2, what it ended up creating is two question objects or instances, okay? So this is the first instance of, this is the first instance of question, and this is the second instance of question. You can also say this is the first object, this is the second object, but question is the class. But when you put a variable and assign a question to it, it becomes its own object with all the attributes and properties of the question class. Now that's how you would use this. But now we can do this. This helps a lot. I mean, we have a question and I can put text, answer, correct, and then if I'm creating a test, I can print the text, print the answers, and compare the user's answer with the correct answer. And I can work like that. But I can enhance this object. Remember I said objects have attributes, but they can also perform actions? Well, we can perform certain actions here if we define them inside the class question. So I'm going to delete this. And let's put some actions here. So the first action I'm going to check is to check whether someone has the correct answer. So I define this little function is correct. It takes in two parameters, self and the answer provided. And what I'm going to return is whether the answer provided is equal to the correct answer. Now, what is this self thing here? Self is, remember the difference between class and instance? Self is the instance of the class, and I have to pass it to every method inside my class. Also, if I want to access this variable that is in the question object, right, I need to prepend it with the word self.correct. So self.correct is basically the correct answer for this instance of the class. And I'm comparing that to the parameter answer. So this will be clear as we use it more. And I can use this. I can create Q1 equals question, and then Q1.text equals what's the area of a square, and Q1.correct can be side times side, right? And then I can say, for example, I can print the text of Q1, and then I can get, for example, from the input, right? From the input, I can get the user answer, input, and then a little thing to know that there's an input, and then I can compare that user input to the correct answer, and I can say print is correct, and then I just put the user input, right? Oops, not is correct, Q1 dot is correct. So look at what's happening here. I created a question object. I gave it some parameters. At least I need the q1.correct. I printed the text. I asked the user for its input in the answering the question, and then I'm just going to use the same object q1, and I'm going to say dot is correct. So is the user answer the correct answer? And I'm going to print that, right? So let's do that. I'm going to clear this output and run it. Oops, I have a problem here. There. I need to close that parenthesis in the print. So let's run it. And it says, what's the area of a square? I'm going to say side times side. And then it says true because it was correct. Now, this is really interesting. The own object can tell whether an answer provided is correct or not. So the object now can do things. Now, I can do even more specific things. Like, for example, when I instantiate an object, what is this open and close parentheses that I'm having there? Well, this is so that I can initialize things in the object. So if I define a function called underscore underscore init underscore underscore, you will see it in a second. This is what's called a constructor. Okay, so I define a function that's underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And this will take parameters. Self is going to be the first parameter. And then any parameters I want. In this case, I'm going to take text, answers, and correct. What I can do with init is the first thing that will get executed when I instantiate an object. And what I can use it for is usually to initialize values and get my object ready. So if you pass in your parameters a text, alternative answers, and what's the correct answer, I will say this text that's coming in, this text, is going to be assigned to self.text, to this text over there. That's self.text. Answers is going to be assigned to self.answers. So this parameter answers is going to be assigned to self.answers over there, the object's answers list. And then correct, this variable that's coming in as a parameter, it's going to be assigned to correct the object's correct variable. This is my initialization, right? And how do I use this? Well, I can say, for example, I can create a question, right? Or I can create a couple of questions like this. So here, for example, I can create a couple of questions. In this case, I've created 3 questions. Q1 is question, open parentheses, but instead of closing the parentheses, I'm going to supply the parameters for these 3 variables. The first one is what's the square root of 4, I'm sorry. The second one is the list of potential answers, 16, 4, and 2. And then the last one is the correct answer, 2. Now, I'm using strings because that's how I'm comparing it to, right? I can totally use numbers here. It doesn't matter. Then I'm going to define question 2. A right angle is how many degrees? And then I provide the alternatives and then the correct answer. And the same thing for question 3. Now I don't have to say q1.text equals q2.q1.something equals. I can just, at the moment of creation, I can pass these parameters and I can, you can check, I can print q1.text. And you will see how that prints what is the square root of 4, right? So the properties are defined because this constructor initializes them. Now, I can have another method, for example, here, because I want to present these questions in a certain way in my questionnaire, right? So I can define, for example, a method here in my class. I can define a method that creates a string from the variables of the class. All methods in my class will have to have at least one parameter, which is self. This is true for all objects in Python. Okay, your first parameter is going to be self. And what I do, I'm going to say, okay, the resulting string, it's going to start with the text. Which text? Well, this instance text, this object's text, right? Whatever you pass as text. In the case of Q1, it'll be this. right? This text. And then I'm going to loop through the answers. And for each answer, I'm going to call it A. For each answer in the answers of this object, self.answers, I'm going to prepend a new line character, a dash, and the answer. And I'm going to put that in the result. And I'm going to be concatenating that. And then I'll just print down the result. And I can do something like this. Print q1 dot toString. Right? And toString, it requires the self parameter, but the self parameter is passed automatically. So I treat it as if it had no parameters. When it's compiling, when it's running, the self parameter is going to be filled out by the compiler, not your problem. Okay? So if I run this, look at this. What's the square root of 4? And then all three alternatives printed, right? Because of this toString. Now I can save this step, for example, and create my own print method, right? And I can create my own print method here, for example. I'm going to create it down here. I'm going to define print question. Again, the self parameter. And then I'm just going to print the self.toString, so the toString method of this class, okay? Now, you get the idea. I can just say q1.print question, q2.print question, right? q3.print question, for example, right? And now it's super easy to print every question. There's not a lot of code that I need to worry about. I worried about it once, but not again. So let's look at this program running. Here, all three questions printed out, right? Right there. Now, once we have this, you can imagine I can create a list with these questions and loop through each question, printing it and asking for the user's answer and comparing it to see if it's correct. So I can do exactly that. So I can define a test. I like to do these things in functions. So I can define a test function here that does this, right? So this test function will basically create these three questions and put them into a list, right? So now I've created the same three questions, and now I put queues for questions. It's going to be a list of questions 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to assign, a variable points. They're going to start at 0 points. That's what you start off with in the quiz. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to loop through this list of questions, printing and getting users' answers. So I'm going to do my little loop here, right? That's going to say for questions, for every question in queues, which is this list of questions, print the question. We know that that's formatted and it's fine. Then get the user's answer. And now I need to compare it to the actual correct answer. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if the question that I'm talking about is correct with this answer. So what I'm saying here is that is this answer the correct answer for the question that I'm looking at this point? Then I increase the points. Otherwise, I'll print incorrect. At the end of all this, I can just do, I can just print the total number of points. And you can see it here, right? So let's run this program. Whoops, this is a function test. So at some point I have to call it from outside. I created a function. So now I run this program and it says, what's the square root of 4? It's printing the one question. So it went to question 1. It printed it, and now it's asking me for the answer. So the answer for me is going to be 2. And then it's going to check whether it's correct, and it's going to continue. A right angle is how many degrees? So let's do it incorrectly. Let's say 180. It's printing the second question. It's asking me for my answer, and now it's going to see if my answer is correct, it's going to add a point. Otherwise, it's going to print incorrect. So I'm going to put 180, which is not correct. And it says incorrect. And then it moves to the next question. What's the area of a triangle? And I can answer base times height divided by 2. And then it says total points 2, the first and the last question. So what's important here is that once I created my object, right, with all the functions and I design my object, I can use it as a data type that is on steroids, right? It can do a bunch of things. I can initialize it however I want, and then I can use them in lists. I can access these methods and variables, and I can use it all over the place. If you were doing this with functions, this would be a much lengthier code for each one of your questions and for each one of your checks. Another note, this self variable, you can name it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be named self. Self is just a good name to refer to this same object, right? Self, this, that kind of words. But you can name it whatever you want. But it has to be the first parameter in every single method that you create. And if your method takes no parameters at all, well, guess what? It takes self. At least it takes self. So I hope you like this a little longer video, but it covers the main points of objects in Python.